Hello, in this video we're going to be talking about the cerebrospinal fluid and the blood-brain barrier. So let's not waste any of your time. Let's get right to it. Now, when we're talking the cerebrospinal fluid and the blood-brain barrier, that's tough to say. This picture here, this diagram here, is kind of it's a choroid plexus. Plexus, as we talked about when we talked about nerves, is really just a collection of things designed to get a particular function or job done. But what you have here, we're going to work from the inside. From the outside and working our way in. The greenish rectangles or cubes, if you remember those, the epidermal cells, they're the ones that are going to secrete the cerebrospinal fluid. And of course the red, that's going to be a blood vessel. And in the inside, connective tissue, that's the pia mater in there. So that's what's going on here. But this is the choroid plexus. And this is where the cerebrospinal fluid is made, as I just mentioned. And then you can see that a lot of things are done to keep those two separate. And we're going to talk about how that works when we talk the blood-brain barrier. The brain has to monitor the blood, and there's certain areas that happens. But you don't want the spinal fluid in the blood intermixing or being able to get together and mix together. But we will talk about all that functions and how this all works in this video. Alright, so in this screen, let's set up some note-taking suggestions. We're going to tell you, I'm going to tell you everything that happens through the entire process of the cerebrospinal fluid making its way through all the areas of the brain and the spinal cord. I'm going to tell them to you on this screen, and then the rest of the screens are going to take a portion of that and really break it down, describe it. And it'll have the words, so you'll take notes on each of those. 1 through 8, if you look at the numbers here, and you'll have notes on those. So on this screen, after you collect a little bit that's below me here, the best may be to just sit and relax and listen, or if you want to take a picture of the pathway, but it's also in your book, it's also in the PowerPoint. So keep that in mind as well. So we'll start at the beginning. In the lateral ventricles, okay, number 1, and almost simultaneously number 2. But that's one. So in each of the ventricles, more cerebrospinal fluid is made. So keep that in mind. So on the 2 ventricles, we're going to make some, and it's going to pass that interventriculary foramen that we mentioned down into the 3rd ventricle, where we're going to make some more cerebrospinal fluid. And then it passes down into the 4th ventricle, and we're going to make some more. So now we're all the way down to 5, and 5 is essentially to the left of the cerebellum area. It's sitting on that white branch there, but it'll go in there and bathe everything, and then the pathway continues. It not only bathes the exterior, but it gets down into all those fissures of the cerebellum and stuff like that. So it really works it over, and then down into the 7, and 7 where it kind of branches out. It can go down into the spinal column. It can go back up around the rest of the brain, and of course in the spinal column it can work its way back up and around the pathways on the left side, as you can see, passing underneath the pituitary gland, which is that little thing that's hanging down there between the pons and the left front cortex there, as you can follow along there, and then back around till it gets to spot number 8. spot number 8 at the arachnoid villa, that's where the cerebrospinal fluid is reabsorbed, broken down, cleaned up, filtered, whatever, and then pumped back into the lateral ventricles and start the process over again. So that's a breakdown, and as I mentioned on each of the slides to come, it's going to take a small part of that and talk about it. So you'll be able to, so you don't have to try to write down all those little things. Each of them will be covered in their own screen, and then you can collect that information then. So, sorry about that. I had a little lost track of what slide I need to collect next. So the cerebrospinal fluid, if you've ever seen anything in reference to it in a movie or TV or whatever, if you've seen somebody have it removed, maybe you watched a documentary or surgical, or maybe even a veterinarian situation. But it's clear, colorless, as you can see there. And again, produced in each of the 4 ventricles. It's made, and of course, as we mentioned, reabsorbed in the arachnoid villa back at section 8, which is right in here somewhere. All right, continuing. As it flows around, it comes out of the lateral ventricles down into the 3rd ventricle, and from then it heads over to the cerebellum area, and not only bathes the exterior, but it gets down into all the succuli and all the fissures of that area, and then at that point in time heads back down and begins to separate, as I mentioned, at spot, what we call junction 7 on the diagram anyway. It's not called junction 7, but it's 7 on the diagram. And then out, either down into the spinal cord or up and around, okay, around the exterior of the brain. And then, of course, the spinal cord, it can go back up and around the left side, and it all kind of flows into that. And you can think of that spot 8, which again is just kind of right over in here somewhere, like a drain. So it drains back down into, gets filtered out, cleaned up, and then back into the lateral ventricles to be to produce some more. All right, so functions of the cerebral spinal fluid. Okay, buoyancy is number 1. Okay, brain, is considerable size, but it also doesn't need to rest on things, and because if it's almost like a fruit that is touching or up against something, that spot seems to bruise, even though it's not really hitting it, it's just touching it, and it does affect it. Okay, the brain kind of just floats just a little bit. There's not much of a gap between the brain and the skull, the brain and the things below, but it does kind of float, or at least it's covered just a little bit to kind of give that, he could take it off of being touched by any particular structure or function. Protection. You bang your head, gives you a little bit of protection, but we know that from car wrecks and violent collisions and even sports to some degree, that's not a foolproof protection. Even football helmets, as we've seen, don't always provide that, but they certainly do a great job at it. We all seen some huge collisions in football games at all levels. But it does provide some protection. But the biggest function is on the next screen. And that's the chemical stability. Okay, the CFS, the cerebral spinal fluid, it cleans up, it brings in resources, it does a lot of things, it enables the brain to monitor everything, and to keep that. And you can see down at the bottom, if it has some things go awry, what are some of the effects of that? High pH or glycine, which is some reference to sugars and glucose, or amino acids is what I should have said there. So that's the idea of the functions of the cerebral spinal fluid. Alright, now for the blood-brain barrier. Okay, this is a system designed to keep the blood intact, or the blood inside the capillaries, and not to be leaking out to areas where it doesn't belong. And the diagram beside me here to the right, and you can see those neuroglial cells. We talked about those back in the very first chapter of the brain system. It was actually the second chapter of the school year, second unit. But the neuroglial cells, you can see the astrocytes there. We just talked about the epididymal cells, but these are part of the process of keeping that clean, keeping those capillaries intact. Just like the pipes going into your house, you do not want any holes or leaks or things like that. And the blood barrier system is the same way. Alright, blood-brain barrier, again, protects the capillaries. Tight junctions, the epididymal cells refer to. Tight junctions refers to the closeness of the cells, but also the communication levels of the cells. Those tight junctions allow the cells to communicate with each other, and so they're always monitoring the situation. It's like if you had security guards or military around a particular compound, and they were either protecting it, guarding it, or defending it, and they're just security watching out. And they've each got walkie-talkies, and they're spread out a little bit, but they're pretty dense, as far as maybe just 10 feet apart around a building, and they're in constant communication with each other about what they're seeing, what they're hearing, what's going on there, so they can make the adjustments quickly. That's what the tight junctions and the epididymal cells are providing, the blood-brain barrier. Alright, and then as we mentioned, the choroid plexus at the beginning, but that's where it's really got to focus on keeping that separate. It's got the circumventricular organs that help with that in the third and fourth ventricle, and it's referenced there kind of in the middle. What happens when there is a leak? You can get stuff that's in the blood, okay, onto the brain, whether it's pathogens, viruses, whatever it may be, and that's just something that you don't want to have happen. So it's got to be a really tight fit situation, keeping the brain clean. Excuse me. Alright, so there are points, okay, that the blood does have direct access to the brain, and that's not it's for the brain to get some resources, but it's also so the brain can monitor the quality of the blood and make any changes. I mean, whether it's glucose, pH levels, molarity, or any numerous other things that's got to be checked out. The CVOs, the circumventricular outlets, have provide a path for that, to keep that monitored at all times. Well, that's our video for the blood-brain barrier, cerebral spinal fluid. The next time we come together, we're going to be talking about structure and functions of the brain. We'll see you then.